More than 70 Russian military vehicles were reported destroyed or disabled within a matter of hours, transforming what was intended to be a rapid armored advance into one of Moscow's most costly setbacks along the Donetsk-Luhansk line in recent months. According to available reporting, this outcome was not the result of a chance encounter or a single decisive strike. Instead, the engagement unfolded in an environment that had already been observed, analyzed, and prepared in advance. As the Russian column moved forward, Ukrainian forces were reportedly monitoring the area using a combination of aerial surveillance, thermal sensing, and signals analysis. Drone feeds provided continuous overhead observation, while thermal signatures revealed vehicle movement even where terrain or concealment limited visual clarity. At the same time, increased radioactivity indicated coordinated maneuvering, suggesting that the movement was a planned offensive rather than a routine transfer. By the time Russian units became aware that they were under attack, key elements of the formation had already been disrupted. Reports indicate that several vehicles were struck early, routes were obstructed, and command and control links came under pressure. Analysts note that this early disruption reduced the ability of the column to maneuver or respond effectively once contact began. The significance of the engagement extends beyond the number of vehicles affected. Military observers point out that the incident highlights broader changes in modern warfare, where visibility, predictability, and slow adaptation can carry heavy costs. Large armored formations are increasingly difficult to conceal, and once control is lost in the opening phase of an engagement, regaining momentum can be extremely challenging. Early detection played a central role in shaping the outcome. Reporting suggests the Russian column was identified well before reaching a point where speed or armor could offer protection. Persistent UAV coverage tracked the convoy as it moved across open ground and through tree lines, allowing observers to assess spacing, direction, and tempo. This made it possible to identify how tanks and armored vehicles were positioned relative to lighter elements and support units. Thermal monitoring added further detail, revealing changes in engine heat that indicated slowing, clustering, or halts within the formation. These patterns helped identify potential command vehicles and recovery assets, which analysts say are often critical to maintaining cohesion during an advance. Signals monitoring reinforced these assessments, as a noticeable increase in communications activity suggested active coordination among units approaching contested terrain. According to military analysts, the primary advantage gained from this early observation was not speed, but clarity. By understanding how the column was organized and how it was likely to operate, Ukrainian planners were able to shape the engagement rather than react to it. This reduced uncertainty and allowed decisions to be made before contact occurred. Notably, the detection phase remained quiet. There were no large-scale artillery strikes or visible movements that might have alerted the advancing force. Observers note that this restraint was deliberate, with fire reportedly held until the column reached a position assessed as most vulnerable. By that point, the layout and rhythm of the formation were already well understood. Analysts describe this approach as reflective of a broader shift in combat operations. Rather than relying primarily on volume of fire, the emphasis was placed on information, timing, and selective engagement. In this framework, control of information determines the conditions of contact, often outweighing numerical strength alone. As a result, the Russian force advanced into an engagement that had already been defined by the opposing side. Ukraine entered the fight with a plan informed by sustained observation, while the outcome of the first moments was shaped by decisions made well before the first strike. Reports indicate that the ambush itself was structured along two axes, with the aim of disrupting the formation as a system rather than targeting individual vehicles in isolation. The battlefield was divided into a forward-blocking element and a rear pressure zone, limiting both movement and the ability to reorganize once contact began. The first axis focused on the heavy armor at the front of the advance. Analysts note that the tanks and armored carriers at the front of the column were expected to create space and establish the pace of the advance. As a result, this leading element became the most effective point for slowing everything that followed. Fire directed at these vehicles was intended not only to disable them, but to delay movement. On narrow routes, a halted or damaged tank can become a physical obstacle that alters traffic flow and timing for the entire formation. Once the front slowed, following units were forced closer together, reducing maneuverability and increasing exposure. At the same time, a second axis of pressure was applied to the mobile elements operating behind the heavy armor. Light vehicles and infantry units relied on speed, and on gaps created by the lead tanks to move safely. Pressure on this group aimed to remove those advantages. When fire was directed into these rear elements, movement routes narrowed and coordination weakened, as drivers and dismounted troops were forced to react without clear guidance from the front. Analysts assess that this created confusion that could not easily be resolved by either advancing or withdrawing. What made this approach effective, according to military observers, was timing rather than volume of fire. The two axes operated in coordination rather than independently. Actions against the front immediately shaped conditions in the rear, while pressure on the rear further reduced the effectiveness of the front. When a lead vehicle stopped or was destroyed, space disappeared for those behind it. When rear elements came under pressure, the front lost situational awareness and support. Together, these effects compressed the formation, turning what had been a moving advance into a congested mass. This layout denied the advancing force the ability to reorganize under fire. Analysts note that recovery from losses typically requires space and time to regroup and restore coordination. The two-axis design removed both. Attempts to maneuver around blockages increased exposure to fire from the rear pressure zone, while remaining in place left vehicles vulnerable to strikes from the forward block. Control of terrain played a significant role in this phase. Positions were reportedly selected to limit detours and keep vehicles confined to predictable routes. As the convoy entered these areas, movement options narrowed and decisions carried immediate consequences. This environment favored the ambush, as predictability accelerated targeting while slowing responses. The result was a rapid loss of tactical cohesion. Although individual vehicles could still move or fire, the formation as a whole could no longer operate as a unified force. Command signals struggled to translate into action once vehicles were separated by damage, smoke, and blocked routes, without a clear understanding of conditions across the column. Coordination broke down at a critical moment. This breakdown helps explain why the engagement escalated quickly. Analysts point out that when formations lose internal links, pressure compounds rather than disperses. Each disabled vehicle created new obstacles, and each obstacle contributed to further disruption. The two-axis ambush exploited this dynamic by targeting areas where recovery depended on cooperation between units. According to reporting, the battle was not decided by a single strike. Instead, the collapse of the forward line proved decisive within minutes. Russian T-72 tanks, BTR armored carriers, and MTLB vehicles at the front were hit early, halting momentum and removing the protective screen that the rest of the column relied on to advance. The immediate effects were physical. When a lead tank was disabled, road space behind it disappeared, leaving following vehicles without a clear path forward or backward. Smoke, debris, and burning fuel reduced visibility, forcing crews to slow down and cluster closer together. Analysts note that this compression quickly transformed an organized movement into a static target area. Loss of the forward line also reduced situational awareness. Lead elements normally absorb initial contact and relay information, but once those vehicles were disabled, the flow of updates diminished. Crews behind them could not clearly see what had been hit or identify the source of incoming fire. Under pressure, radio traffic became fragmented, and hesitation replaced movement at a moment when speed was critical. Precision fire reinforced these effects by focusing on command and control nodes rather than attempting to strike every vehicle. Artillery and drone strikes reportedly targeted command vehicles and relay points, reducing coordination rather than simply decreasing numbers. When command vehicles fell silent, units behind them were left to act with incomplete information. Orders arrived late or not at all, leading crews to respond instinctively rather than according to a coordinated plan. Analysts emphasize that this was the point at which recovery became unlikely. A force can continue to fight after taking losses, but it cannot continue to advance without effective control. With the front disrupted, vehicles behind it faced limited choices. Advancing risked entering blocked routes, while stopping increased exposure to follow-on strikes. Neither option restored cohesion. Unmanned aerial systems maintained constant observation over exposed positions. Once the lead armor halted, overhead surveillance reportedly identified targets and passed information to firing units in near real time. This shortened response times and reduced the need for adjustment. Strikes concentrated on areas where vehicles slowed or clustered, REI, enforcing the ongoing disruption. The loss of the forward screen also exposed support vehicles that were not intended to operate under direct fire. Recovery assets and ammunition carriers moved closer as the column slowed, bringing them within range of precision attacks. Once these vehicles were disabled, analysts note that restoring mobility became increasingly difficult, as damaged armor could no longer be recovered or resupplied. By this stage, the formation no longer functioned as a single force. It broke into isolated groups reacting independently under stress. Some crews attempted to maneuver around obstacles, while others remained in place awaiting instructions or cover. This fragmentation prevented any coordinated response, even though individual vehicles retained the ability to engage. The speed of the collapse is a key point highlighted by observers. From initial contact to the loss of the forward line, only a short period passed, and that interval largely determined the outcome. Once command links were disrupted and lead armor was removed, subsequent events followed a pattern of increasing disorganization rather than sustained resistance. This phase illustrates why modern engagements increasingly focus on disrupting structure rather than maximizing destruction. By targeting the forward line and command elements, the ability to operate as a coordinated unit was removed. Pressure on rear elements then deepened the breakdown. As attention shifted behind the stall, D-front, firepower was directed toward vehicles carrying mobility, supplies, and follow-on firepower. Pickups, motorcycles, and small mobile teams, which relied on speed and spacing, became exposed as both advantages disappeared. When movement slowed and routes narrowed, these vehicles clustered in areas where they were more visible from above. FPV drones were reportedly used extensively in this phase, due to their ability to strike quickly and select specific targets. Analysts note that drones were directed toward vehicles carrying ammunition, crew-served weapons, and air defense equipment. When one vehicle detonated, nearby vehicles were often affected, spreading disruption through the group. This also produced a significant psychological effect. Drivers who witnessed explosions nearby hesitated or swerved, sometimes causing collisions or blocking narrow routes. Once movement became instinctive rather than controlled, exposure to follow-up strikes increased. Precision artillery reinforced these effects by focusing on key terrain rather than attempting to pursue individual vehicles. Fire was directed at routes where units might attempt to turn, regroup, or withdraw. Each strike reduced available options, forcing remaining vehicles to stay within areas already under aerial observation. Analysts assessing the engagement note that the combined use of aerial drones and ground-based artillery effectively created a closed battle space. Vehicles that attempted to withdraw encountered red-blocked routes or incoming fire, while those that halted remained under continuous observation from above. There was no identifiable pause point where commanders could restore order or redirect movement. Support elements were particularly affected during this phase. As the column slowed, vehicles carrying ammunition and recovery equipment moved forward in an attempt to restore momentum. When these assets were struck, the ability to recover damaged vehicles or resupply forward units was lost. Analysts note that this rapidly converted temporary damage into permanent losses, as disabled armor could no longer be extracted or repaired. The pace of strikes proved more decisive than their volume. FPV drones were reportedly employed in successive waves, maintaining constant pressure and limiting the opportunity for crews to adapt based on earlier contact. Each attempt to change movement patterns drew a rapid response, and those responses increased disorder rather than restoring control. Coordination within the Russian formation continued to degrade as units became isolated. Some personnel dismounted and sought cover, while others remained inside vehicles, anticipating movement once space opened. Precision strikes also extended beyond the immediate contact zone, undermining the perception of a protected rear area. Vehicles positioned away from the front line were still engaged, turning the entire formation into a contested space rather than a layered advance. By the time smoke obscured rear positions, analysts assessed that control of the engagement had shifted decisively. What began as an armored advance had transitioned into a series of localized survival efforts. Movement no longer supported operational goals, and firepower no longer contributed to cohesion. Observers note that when drones and precision artillery operate together, light mobility can become a liability rather than protection. The collapse of the rear elements followed a deliberate pattern. According to military analysis, support assets, morale, and available options were targeted simultaneously. With the front blocked and the rear disrupted, the column ceased to function as a coordinated force. From that point onward, the outcome was shaped by control of space rather than continued maneuver. The result of the engagement became apparent shortly after initial contact. Video analysis from the battlefield indicates that many Russian vehicles were either destroyed or rendered immobile early in the fighting, preventing the advance from reaching its intended objectives. Once the column fragmented, damage accumulated unevenly but decisively. Vehicles that survived initial strikes were often abandoned or left immobilized amid wreckage that restricted movement and visibility. Crews attempting to reposition encountered routes blocked by debris and ongoing fire, while those who remained stationary continued to face aerial pressure. Analysts note that this dynamic turned isolated losses into a broader collapse that could not be reversed through local decision making. The absence of recovery assets was a key factor at this stage. With support vehicles disabled earlier, damaged armor could not be recovered under fire. Vehicles that might have been repairable in other circumstances became permanent losses once left exposed. This accelerated the conversion of tactical damage into longer-term operational cost. Control of the engagement area shifted rapidly as Russian movement slowed to a halt. Ukrainian forces were able to secure ground around the site, not through a large counterattack, but by denying the opposing force the ability to regroup. Smoke, scattered wreckage, and the absence of organized movement indicated that the advance had ended. Reports suggest that Ukrainian losses during this engagement remained limited in comparison. Most reported damage involved minor equipment issues rather than destroyed platforms, and personnel casualties were comparatively low relative to the scale of the action. Analysts highlight this contrast as an example of how preparation and timing can reduce exposure even during intense combat. The stalled advance had effects beyond the immediate battlefield. Follow-on actions in the sector depended on the success of this movement, and its failure disrupted broader operational plans. The resulting pause allowed defenders time to adjust positions and reinforce control. Footage showing immobilized vehicles and abandoned equipment, CI, circulated widely, reinforcing assessments that large formations face increasing difficulty operating under persistent surveillance. Observers note that exposure now begins well before direct contact, altering how commanders must think about movement and concentration. This engagement illustrates a broader shift in modern warfare. While mass and firepower remain relevant, analysts emphasize that they no longer guarantee progress in environments dominated by surveillance and precision strike capabilities. A force that cannot conceal its movement or protect its support elements becomes increasingly vulnerable once detected. By the end of the fighting, the situation was resolved without a prolonged pursuit. The advance had been halted, control of the area established, and the immediate threat reduced. What remained were visible indications of how the engagement unfolded and the operational lessons it produced. Analysts conclude that numbers alone are no longer decisive when information dominance and precision fire shape the battlefield. Beyond a single ambush, what occurred along the Donetsk-Luhansk line highlights how early detection, layered surveillance, precision engagement, and a coordinated two-axis approach can disrupt an advance at multiple levels. Forward armor was halted, rear elements were neutralized, and command links were disrupted before recovery was possible. The result was a rapid collapse driven by loss of control rather than exhaustion of equipment. While comprehensive, independently verified damage figures remain limited, available battlefield footage and open-source analysis point to significant Russian losses and comparatively limited Ukrainian damage. More important than the exact numbers, analysts say, is the pattern itself. Once movement was exposed and options disappeared, the outcome became increasingly predictable. This raises broader questions about the future of large armored operations in environments where drones monitor routes continuously and precision weapons can strike with little warning. Some analysts suggest future offensives may require smaller units, tighter coordination, and stronger counter-surveillance measures. Others caution that adaptation remains ongoing and conclusions are still forming. What is clear is that adaptation will shape future outcomes. How forces respond to these conditions will influence who maintains the initiative and who bears the cost of operating under outdated assumptions.